Welcome to Golden Girl, a space where we dive deep into health, healing, connection, and community. I'm your host, Becca Golden, and this podcast is all about sharing and documenting my journey. Each episode, we'll discuss topics like health and wellness, what I'm learning in therapy, work-life balance, relationships, community, and all the ways I strive for more aliveness and presence every day. Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Golden Girl. This episode, I have Madeline here with me.
Hi.
And I'm just going to tell Madeline a story about something that happened earlier this week because I had an opportunity to basically relive a traumatic event. And I now have a lot of tools that allowed me to move through the triggering experience very differently than I used to. And I'm really proud of myself for how I handled it. And it's such a testament to how much I've learned and grown in this past year of trauma therapy. It was a wild experience and I'm really proud of it.
It's so easy to focus on where we still need to improve, but I'm glad that we're taking a minute to focus on a small victory.
This is a huge victory.
Even better.
It's a huge, huge victory. I'm very proud of myself for this.
Okay.
So here's the story. So at work, every 3 years, I have this like huge project that comes to a close. And I usually spend about a year on this project. And so the stakes are pretty high. It's just a really important thing. And as it comes to a close, it becomes very stressful and intense. And 3 years ago, when I went through this project coming to a close, it was so traumatic for me. That's what launched all of these events that started my health spiraling out of control. This specific project played such a huge role in it. And when I was going through that experience 3 years ago, I had a lot of days where I would be on back-to-back video calls over Zoom for hours on end, and I would ignore all of the needs and signals from my body. What I do for my job, for work, like I'm in tech, like these are not lives that we're saving. So just like take that into consideration when I say that these were important calls. Lives were not at stake. But in the context of what I do, this was very, very important. And I felt the pressure of it. And I put a lot of the pressure on myself 3 years ago. And it broke me. And I really couldn't recover. And when I used to have those days, I would go through the day. And when I was finally off of the video calls, usually around like 8 p.m., I was off of video calls. And then I would just feel really stuck and frozen. And then I would have another couple calls not on video where I was like debriefing and making food for myself, like making dinner, the first meal that I would have eaten. Or sometimes all I had was like peanut butter for dinner because like I didn't have groceries because I hadn't had time to shop. Like I had no time because I was glued to the computer screen. So this time around, now I've gone through over a year of trauma therapy. I'm actively working on my nervous system and I'm actively working on this concept called building self-trust. This is something that I've talked about in previous episodes. We talked about it during the San Diego trip episode a lot. And this is kind of how it works. It's like, okay, I need to build trust with these inner voices inside of me. I need to teach them that they matter and that their needs matter. So this time around, this past week, I was bringing this project to a close. And earlier this week, there was a day, and I didn't expect this day to go like this. I didn't have a jam-packed calendar day, but calls popped up and things popped up. And last minute, I ended up having a day of back-to-back video calls where I didn't have time to go to the bathroom. I didn't have time to make any food for myself. I didn't have time to do anything. And by the time the day was over, it was like 8:30 p.m. that I was finally off of all these calls and I didn't have any food made. I made myself food and I was just like, I felt really frozen and stuck. I was just in this daze and I felt the familiar temptation to just keep all of that inside and like not process it. My nature is to numb and suppress my emotions. After a long day like that, I was so depleted. Like my body physically hurt. I was so exhausted. So then I'm making dinner and in my head, I'm like starting to spiral because I'm thinking to myself, it's 8:30 p.m. I'm supposed to eat dinner 2 hours before bed. I'm supposed to take my binder 2 hours after I eat dinner, but before I go to Like I was so delayed. I had been looking at bright lights, which affects my circadian rhythm, and it was late. Like I had found myself in this place of having made all these decisions that were not in alignment with my health goals.
Yeah.
And I was starting to spiral about how upsetting that was. But I just like kind of stopped that in my brain and just decided not to think about those things. And I finally made dinner and I just like, I couldn't even sit up to eat dinner. I brought my bowl to the floor and I just like laid on the floor. I couldn't even eat it. And I felt like I was so stuck and I could feel tension inside me. I could feel my body was hurting and I was so exhausted. But I also felt things, emotions. And that didn't happen the first time around. 3 years ago, I wasn't feeling
What were you
anything.
feeling?
I didn't know, but I knew there were feelings and I could feel that I could either numb them and suppress them, which was tempting. That felt very enticing. But this time there was an alternative. And I knew that this feeling of like so much overwhelming, tight stuckness, I was like, oh, that means I have emotions that I have to release.
Okay.
I knew that I had emotions that I had to release from that, but I didn't know how. And I was exhausted and scared. And so I called my dad.
Okay.
And I was like, "Hi, I need to let out my emotions." And he's like, "Okay."
Why do you think you called him rather than just trying to sort this out on your own?
I couldn't.
Okay.
I was just stuck. And I do eventually get to that. I'll get to that, but it's kind of like a phone a friend moment. Like when you're in
Okay.
danger,
Sure.
if something bad
He's a
happens to
lifeline.
you, it's a lifeline. Yeah.
Okay.
So he's so caring. He's like, "Well, tell me about what happened." And so I'm like, "I had this stressful day. It reminds me a lot of what happened 3 years ago. And I feel like I ignored my needs." And I'm just starting to say all this out loud. And then I'm like, and I know I need to cry about it to let out all this emotion, but I can't cry, so I need to just cry. And then as soon as he started responding to me, I started crying
Okay.
like violently.
Okay.
I was like shaking on the floor, crying, like pouring out whatever emotion was in me. So then as I'm crying, I wanted him to know that I knew that the circumstance wasn't actually bad. So as I'm crying and just feeling really just the stress of the day, I'm finally getting the stress of the day out of me. I'm saying to him, I know that it was just one day. I know that this is not what my day looks like every day.
Yeah.
I know that it's not going to look like this tomorrow. I know that this was temporary and that it'll all be over tomorrow. However, I feel shame for having had a day that is not in alignment with my health goals. I feel ashamed of myself for having a day that I swore to myself I would never have again. I swore that I would never be a workaholic again.
Yeah.
And in trauma therapy, I do something called IFS. It's called internal family systems. And it's a way of organizing your inner psyche so that every emotion you're feeling can have a persona.
Okay.
And a lot of people will do it with like their inner child.
Mhm.
Your inner child is a separate persona from you, like
Okay.
you are the current you, but your inner child is separate from that. And
Okay.
so it enables you to have a conversation with your inner child, for example.
Okay.
But the way that I go through it is I have a conversation with an emotion of mine.
Okay.
And this is so helpful for me because my experience, I have so many conflicting emotions.
Okay.
I'll feel guilt and I'll also feel really proud for something, for the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's so confusing to unravel. So if I can separate the guilt and the shame and the pride and talk to each one as an individual, it really helps me. So back to the story. As I'm like telling my dad all this, I'm like, I had this stressful day. I ignored all of my needs. I am beating myself up over it. I feel guilt. I feel shame. I feel shame for the way that I went about my day today. And I was trying to just tell him that because I was trying to get to the bottom of what emotion am I bottling up? What emotion am I suppressing? So I'm feeling this shame
Yeah.
for having allowed myself to have a workaholic day that I had promised myself I would never do. So I was ashamed of myself for doing that,
Okay.
for breaking my boundary
Yeah.
or whatever. So then he says, this might not be helpful, but if you think about it, when there's people who might be on a diet and
Have a cheat day.
they have a cheat day or they break their diet and it's not the end of the world. It's like they're on this diet and maybe they mess up. Maybe they accidentally eat something that's not in line with their diet, but then the next day they start over again. So there's really nothing to be ashamed of. You had a day and tomorrow you'll be better, but you don't need to feel ashamed of that.
Yeah.
And the way my immediate response fought back to that, I said, no. And here's why. And I'm really proud of this.
Okay.
And the reason for this is because obviously that's such a sweet, like compassionate
Yeah.
response, totally reasonable.
Yeah.
But what I work on in trauma therapy and what I've been working on for my nervous system is validating my emotions. So what he was
Mm.
saying, and I didn't even have to think about it, my initial instinctual reaction was, no, you are invalidating my shame. My shame matters. I need to talk to my shame, and I'm not going to tell myself that this was nothing to be ashamed of because that invalidates my shame's existence. And I
Good
need to
answer.
validate it. And he was like,
Okay.
like he didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
So he was like, Okay, what do I say?" And I'm like crying through this and I didn't know. I was in such a crazy place. This all happened in a matter of like seconds. I'm
Sure.
crying. So he's like, "Okay, I don't know what to say." And I'm like, "Don't say anything. I think I need to talk to my part. I think I need to talk to the shame." And he's like, "Okay, what do I do?" I'm like,
Nothing.
I said, "I need you to be a witness." And it just came out of me. I didn't even think about it. It's just I knew immediately, do not invalidate my shame. I need you to be a witness. And I can't believe I said that, but it is
Great.
something that I've learned in therapy is that I really love to have a witness. I don't like to process difficult emotions completely on my own. It feels really scary and isolating.
Okay.
I find a lot of comfort in having someone with me through it.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that that was why I was calling him at first, but I think that was why.
Yeah.
And
Great
so I
observation.
said, "I need you to be a witness." And he's like, "Okay." And I'm like, do you mind just listening while I talk to my shame part? We're going to talk to it. We're going to talk to the part like it's a person." He's
Great.
like, "All right." So I'm like, "Hi, shame. What's up? Like, I know you're here. What are you trying to protect me from? Like, what is it that you're trying to protect me from?" And the shame immediately is like, "I'm trying to protect you from being a workaholic." And I said, "Okay, thank you for trying to protect me from being a workaholic. I appreciate that. I also don't want to be a workaholic." And the shame's like, "Oh, okay, good. Well, you had this crazy day." So, and I'm like, "Yeah, I know. Just so you know, I chose to have that day today. I know that it might have seemed like I'm becoming a workaholic again, but I chose to get on those calls back to back. I chose to take on that stress for one day because I knew it was temporary." And the shame was like, "Oh, I didn't know it was temporary. I didn't know that you chose that. I thought it was happening to you." And I said, "Nope. I knew what I was doing. I decided to have a day like that because I know that tomorrow I'm going to do better." And the shame was like, "Okay, so you're not going to be a workaholic anymore?" And I'm like, "No, I'm still not going to be a workaholic." And it said, "Okay, well, I felt betrayal from you because you told me that you wouldn't have a workaholic day like this, and you did. And that broke trust with us because you did the thing that you told me you weren't going to do. And that hurts my feelings, and that makes me feel betrayed." And I said, "I understand that you'd feel that way. I'm sorry that I broke the trust. I'm sorry that I did actions that I said I wouldn't do. I didn't deny it. I just validated the shame."
Great.
So basically, this whole conversation is just me saying to the shame, "Thank you for being here. I validate your existence. I appreciate what you're trying to protect me from. And I'm on the same page as you. I also don't want to be a workaholic." And then the shame went away.
And then you felt immediately better?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And my dad was like, "What the hell just happened?"
I love that.
I go,
Kudos to your dad. And the fact that you said, I just need you to listen and witness this with me. And he said, okay, is really amazing. That's really amazing. And so then you felt better.
yeah, I think it's nice that I had someone that I could call who felt like a safe space for me to just process whatever it was. Like, to do a really quick recap, I basically relived a traumatic experience. And while I was in the thick of it, I could feel myself being pulled to repeat old patterns that didn't serve me. And instead, I didn't quite know what to do yet, but I knew I needed to do something. I
Yeah.
called my dad, I reached out. I did not isolate or withdraw. I proactively sought a witness to just be with me while I figured out what it was. I was in a very fragile place. I felt the need to express my emotion. I let out my emotion. And then I validated my feelings that didn't align with the logic. Like I knew
No, but
logically it
they
was
were
just a
great.
day,
That
but
dialogue.
it was a feeling that needed
Yeah.
validation. And before I called my dad, I was just stuck spiraling in my head of like the logic playing over. It was not productive.
Yeah.
And all I needed to do is cry it out and validate that everything I was feeling was valid
Mhm.
and have a witness.
Mhm.
And it was so beautiful because I never did that before.
Yeah.
And to relive an experience that your nervous system perceived as traumatic and choose to do it differently on the fly without even warning. It's not like I knew this day was
Right.
coming up,
Right.
but I chose it on the fly. My body wanted to be better. My
Yeah.
body wanted to feel peace. And my body knew that doing the really scary thing, just facing all of this emotion head on and allowing it to be released from my body, even though that was not familiar to me, that was a new pattern. It is very scary to establish a new pattern. It's so much easier to repeat a pattern that you know is harmful, but is familiar.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to establish a new pattern. And you can know the tools, but it's so easy to just fall back into your
Yeah.
old unhelpful patterns, and I didn't. My instinct was not to. My
Yeah.
instinct was, "Hang on, let's wait a second. There's another way." And then I did it differently, and I'm so proud of myself.
Here's the real question. Did you eat dinner
I
after?
did,
Oh,
but it didn't feel like I was eating to numb. It felt like I was eating because I knew I needed nourishment, and I felt like I had
earned it's the wrong word, but
I had processed all the emotions that were stuck, and that created space to then feed my body what it needed, nourishment.
yeah.
Whereas before, 3 years ago, I would feel stuck and then I would like make myself eat and then I'd just feel more stuck. I doubt my body was like even digesting the food back
Sure.
then because like you need to feel like you're in rest and digest to digest food. But it's just, I was so proud. I am so proud of myself because it seems like the simplest example. You're upset, you call a friend, the friend is like, well, it's just one day, nothing to worry about, don't worry. And for some people, that might feel invalidating.
Interesting.
But I never would have thought about that before
Yeah.
because I invalidated myself all the time back then.
Yeah.
So I didn't isolate. I reached out for help. I faced my fears. It took a lot of courage for me to do this. I was just so scared to cry it out, but I did.
How did you feel the day after?
Going through that day was so taxing on me because of where I'm at with my healing. I don't have the stamina to have days like that very often. And I had had a hard week leading up to the day. The next day, I felt really tired and burnt out and just depleted. But I didn't feel stuck emotionally. I didn't feel like I was carrying the trauma or the stress of that situation. I was really tired, but I think if I hadn't reached out for help and I just kept all that emotion in me and all the stress, it creates more health symptoms.
Yeah.
You have to process this stuff. And I'm a highly sensitive person that I've
Yeah.
learned that.
You didn't bottle it up. You let it
I
out.
didn't bottle it up. I let it out and I didn't withdraw. I used to withdraw from people. I used to isolate and I wouldn't want to answer my phone. I wouldn't want to answer texts. I proactively reached out for help.
Yeah.
And I knew that the help I needed was really within myself, but I knew that I needed support while I processed it.
You did.
Yeah, it was really beautiful.
Good.
After it all happened, my dad was like, I don't really know what just happened, but I'm glad you're feeling better. The funniest thing is like as soon as I had gotten to this point, I was like, hang on, I need to take notes.
Oh my gosh.
And the reason is because I block out my traumatic experiences
Sure.
and I didn't want to forget this. This was traumatic. It was a really emotionally charged and delicate. Like these are emotions from like the deep, deep depths, like
Yeah.
the core of your heart, like
Yeah.
the trauma from
Well, the
years
bad,
ago.
this is like the deep bad times.
These were the deep bad times and I was like reliving it.
Yeah.
It's like a bad dream, but you do the dream differently. So after it was done, I was like just trying to write down what happened so that I
Yeah.
didn't forget how I had worked through each of those steps in my head because it really all happened in the span of a few minutes.
Sure. I still think that conversation you had with the shame sounds super valuable.
It is, and those are the types of conversations I have in therapy all the time with all of my inner emotions
Mm.
and parts, and sometimes it's parts of me who are different ages, sometimes it's parts of me who are different emotions. I have discussions with my emotions as if they have their own point of view, and it's amazing how much they have to say,
Yeah.
and it's weird. It's like, it took me a while to wrap my head around it because I'm like talking to my imaginary friends in there, but you have to just let that
Go
go.
for it.
You have to just let that go, and it opens up so much room for deep healing that I didn't know was possible.
Yeah. Well, and I could see someone who doesn't know you, who's just listening to this podcast, a bystander, saying, man, that sounds really silly. That sounds goofy and weird. But I think people who have that initial reaction are probably the ones that have a lot of emotions that have a lot they want to actually say.
Or maybe there are people who just aren't so sensitive. Some people, their emotions aren't as complex. They just feel what they feel. I think it's because of the way that I was raised. I was conditioned to believe that my emotions weren't valid. My emotions were too much. My emotions were inconvenient. I used to cry all the time.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I would cry all the time. I was constantly crying to the point where it just became annoying for my family to deal with. It's like, she's always crying. But it's because everything was always so overwhelming for me or upsetting for me, or I didn't feel like I had the ability to convey what my experience was. I felt misunderstood. There were so many reasons that I needed to cry, but I learned that crying was not appropriate for all the situations. And I learned to bottle up a lot of this. So for people who weren't as sensitive as a kid and weren't taught that, maybe it doesn't matter.
Well, maybe it does. I don't know. Maybe it does. I'm glad that you cried, and I'm glad that it washed away all the bad feelings.
It really did. It was so beautiful and raw.
The next time this happens, the next time you have a unforeseen traumatic experience, you will be equipped to phone a friend if you need a witness and to talk to your emotions the way that you've practiced in trauma therapy in order to wash that away the next time. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, and I would say it's not about washing it away because that's also maybe dismissing
Okay.
them.
Maybe the wrong phrase.
I wanna be moving through the emotions and processing them
Yeah.
instead of dismissing them or
Yeah.
suppressing them. Because for me, it's a new experience to honor the emotions that I have that don't really have a logical explanation, or the emotions that don't feel fair. Because a lot of my emotions aren't fair. A lot of my emotions don't feel justified. I justify my way out of them, but I have to honor them.
I know that this is a big ask, but I would love if you recorded one of these trauma awakenings because it's very vulnerable, but it really is so moving. If that ever happens to you and you
I
push
fully
record,
would. I mean, I have recordings of me having these revelations from over the last couple years when I was just doing my documenting of my unraveling of my health, but yeah, I would have recorded the whole thing if I hadn't talked to
had
my dad,
known.
but
Yeah,
yeah, like, I didn't know I was gonna have that,
sure.
but yeah, I wish I could have recorded it. I wish I had the podcast
Already.
set up, and, like, it doesn't feel too vulnerable for me. Like, part of my existence as a human is that I wanna be seen for who I am. I wanna feel understood. So, the more tools I can give everyone else around me who's interested in knowing me to get to know me, like, I want people to understand me at my core,
Yeah,
'cause that makes me feel good.
good.
So, I would love it if people got to witness me moving through my trauma. That sounds
It's
great.
amazing.
Yeah,
Wow. Thank you for sharing that story.
yeah, and we were talking about the importance of building self-trust.
Mhm.
Building self-trust means validating your emotions.
Yeah. And saying no when someone is leading you astray and you know that it's not the solutionizing that you are looking for.
Yeah, when someone is, like, offering you advice that does not align with where you're at, I think it's okay to say, "That advice doesn't make sense for me."
Yeah.
There are other people in my life who have a lot of mindset shifting that helps them. We were talking about this before, but affirmations can sometimes feel like gaslighting to me if I'm telling myself over and over, like, there are a lot of affirmations out there that you can find that are just repeating phrases to help teach your brain to believe in something. But for me, if I don't believe the affirmation is true, it's very harmful for me because
Yeah.
that's just repeating gaslighting language in my head. That's
Yeah.
like telling myself a lie over and over that breaks self-trust.
Yeah.
So I think whatever self-trust means for you is what you should focus on. And for me, that means validating all my emotions.
Good. Emotions validated.
Thank you for listening to my story.
I loved it.
You always validate my emotions too.
That wasn't what I expected.
What were
And
you expecting?
I had no idea that communicating with your feelings was the way that you were going to resolve bad feelings. And I'm really glad that you were able to recognize that that was going to be helpful once you were able to recognize that it was a tool and then achieve it. So, kudos.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode. Let us know if you want to hear more of my trauma healing adventures. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.